I signed the papers on a Tuesday. I remember because my sister Carol had driven 3 hours from Tucson to sit with me, and her coffee was still warm on the kitchen table when the courier knocked on the door. I didn't drink it. I just stood there holding an envelope with my husband's attorney's return address on it. And I thought, 41 years. That's what this envelope is worth to him. 41 years, folded into a set of legal documents, handed to me by a stranger in a brown uniform who asked me to sign a receipt. I signed the receipt. I did not sign anything else. My husband's name is Richard. He is 71 years old. And for most of those years, I believed he was a good man. Not a warm man, not always a gentle one, but a man who worked hard and kept his word and came home every night to the house we built together in Scottsdale, Arizona. We had 3 children. We had a real estate business we had spent 22 years growing from a single rental property into a portfolio worth considerably more than either of us had imagined when we started. We had a life. I thought we had a life. I met Richard when I was 26. He was 30 years old and already certain about everything what he wanted, where he was going, how things ought to be done. I found that certainty attractive then. It felt like safety. I was a kindergarten teacher making $23,000 a year, and he was a man who had plans. When we married, I left teaching. He asked me to. He said he needed someone to manage the administrative side of the business while he handled acquisitions and client relationships. And I said yes, because I trusted him, and because I was 27 and in love, and because I did not yet understand the difference between a partnership and an arrangement. For years, the distinction did not seem to matter. I handled the books, the tenant communications, the tax filings, the property managers, the insurance renewals. I knew every square foot of every building we owned better than Richard did. When we bought our 4th property, in 2003, I was the one who noticed the foundation issue the inspector had missed. When we refinanced in 2008 and the market collapsed around us, I was the one who renegotiated 3 leases in a single week to keep us solvent. Richard made the deals. I made sure the deals survived. We did not always agree. In the last decade of our marriage, we agreed less and less. Richard had developed opinions I did not recognize about money, about control, about what I was and was not entitled to know. He began holding meetings I was not invited to. He began referring to the business as mine instead of ours in conversations with other people, and when I pointed this out to him, he told me I was being sensitive. I was not being sensitive. I was being accurate. But I had spent 40 years learning to doubt my own accuracy when it conflicted with Richard's version of things. And so I let it go. I let a great many things go in those years. I told myself it was the wisdom of a long marriage. I understand now that it was something else entirely. The envelope arrived 14 months ago. Inside it was a petition for divorce, filed in Maricopa County Superior Court, citing irreconcilable differences. There was also a financial disclosure statement required by Arizona law in all divorce proceedings that listed Richard's assets. I read that statement 3 times at the kitchen table while Carol watched me and said nothing. The business was not on it. I don't mean it was undervalued, or that certain properties had been omitted. I mean the entire real estate portfolio, 11 properties, accumulated over 22 years, with a combined assessed value of approximately $4 million, did not appear anywhere on my husband's financial disclosure statement. Instead, there was a footnote. The footnote stated that the assets in question had been transferred 18 months prior to a family trust called the Harmon Family Asset Protection Trust. The footnote further stated that the trust was controlled by its sole trustee, my son, Daniel. I put the papers down. I looked at Carol. She was already looking at me. "Did you know about this trust?" she asked. "No," I said. And that was the truth. I had known nothing about it. Daniel is our oldest. He is 43 years old, and he has worked alongside Richard in the business for the past 8 years. I had always understood this as a good thing, a son learning from his father, a family business passing to the next generation in the natural way of things. I had never understood it as the thing it actually was, which was a decade-long project to remove me from any meaningful ownership of what I had helped build. I did not cry that day. I want to be honest about that. People expect a woman in my position to cry, and I understand why. But what I felt sitting at that table was not grief. It was something older and colder than grief. It was the particular feeling of understanding. All at once. The full shape of something you had been refusing to see clearly for a very long time. Carol asked me what I was going to do. I said I needed to make a phone call. I had a lawyer. His name was Gary Whitfield, and he had handled a real estate dispute for us in 2019. He was a pleasant man, perfectly adequate for reviewing lease agreements and handling minor contract disagreements. He was not, I would learn, the right person for what was happening to me. I called him that afternoon. He listened to what I described. He told me the trust formation was probably legitimate, that asset protection trusts were a common estate planning tool, and that my best approach was likely to negotiate a settlement. I asked him what he thought a fair settlement would be. He mentioned a number. The number he mentioned was less than 15% of what I calculated the portfolio to be worth. I thanked him for his time. That evening, Carol made dinner in my kitchen, and I sat at the counter, and I thought about what I actually knew, separate from what I had been told. I had done the books for 22 years. I knew what assets we had owned, when we had acquired them, and with what funds. I knew that the Harmon Family Asset Protection Trust had been formed 18 months before Richard filed for divorce. What I did not yet know was whether that timing mattered legally, and what my rights were under Arizona law, and whether there was any way to undo what had been done. I knew I needed someone who could answer those questions. Carol found the name. She had a colleague, a woman she worked with in Tucson, whose sister had gone through a contentious divorce involving hidden assets in New Mexico, and who had ultimately recovered what she was owed. The attorney she had used practiced in Phoenix. Her name was Diane Castellano, and her firm specialized in high-asset divorce litigation, with a specific focus on cases involving financial misconduct and fraudulent asset transfers. I called Diane Castellano's office the next morning. Her assistant scheduled a consultation for the following Thursday. I spent the intervening days gathering every document I could: locate tax returns, bank statements, property records, the original operating agreements from when Richard and I had formed our LLC in 2001. I scanned everything. I organized it into folders. I made 2 copies and stored one at Carol's house in Tucson. I want to explain what an asset protection trust is, because my younger son James asked me to explain it when I told him what had happened, and I suspect other people may have the same question. A trust is a legal structure that holds assets on behalf of beneficiaries. When Richard transferred our properties into the Harmon Family Asset Protection Trust, those properties technically ceased to belong to him as an individual. They belonged to the trust. This meant, in theory, that they could not be counted as marital assets in a divorce proceeding because they were no longer his to divide. The key word is in theory. Diane Castellano listened to everything I told her. She was a composed woman in her early 50s, with the particular quality of stillness that I have come to associate with people who have heard a great many difficult things and learned not to be surprised by any of them. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me 2 questions. The first was, did I have documentation showing that I had contributed to the acquisition and management of the properties now held in the trust? I said yes. I had 22 years of it. The second was, did the trust formation predate any documented discussion of divorce between Richard and me, or had there been conversations, arguments, communications of any kind in the period leading up to the trust formation that might indicate it was created in anticipation of the divorce? I thought about this carefully. I thought about a conversation Richard and I had in the spring of 2 years ago when I had confronted him about a pattern of withdrawals from our joint account that I could not reconcile with any business expense I was aware of. I thought about what he had said during that conversation, which was that I needed to stay in my lane. I thought about the fact that I had written down what he said in the small notebook I keep on my nightstand because I had learned over the years that writing things down was the only way I trusted my own memory when Richard later told me I had misunderstood. I told Diane about the notebook. She asked me to bring it to our next meeting. What Diane explained to me over the following weeks was the concept of fraudulent conveyance, the legal principle that a person cannot transfer assets to avoid paying a debt or obligation they know is coming. In Arizona, and in most states, if a spouse transfers marital assets into a trust or other structure in anticipation of divorce proceedings, a court can potentially set aside that transfer and treat the assets as though they still belong to the marital estate. The critical factor is timing and intent. The 18-month gap between the trust formation and the divorce filing was not, on its own, enough. But the conversation I had documented, the one in which Richard told me to stay in my lane, which occurred approximately 6 weeks before the trust was formed, was potentially significant. Combined with the financial records showing the pattern of unexplained withdrawals and my documentation of my contributions to the business over more than 2 decades, Diane believed we had a case worth fighting. She was direct with me about the risks. Litigation of this kind was expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally costly. Richard's attorneys would challenge every document and every claim. The trust formation had been handled by a competent estate attorney and would not be easy to overturn. There was a real possibility, she told me, that I would spend a year in litigation and come away with less than I might have gotten through negotiation. I asked her what she thought the right thing to do was. She told me that wasn't a question she could answer for me. She could tell me what was legally viable. What I chose to do with that information was my own decision. I thought about Gary Whitfield's number. I thought about 15%. I told Diane I wanted to fight. My son Daniel called me 3 days after I retained Diane's firm. He did not call to apologize, or to explain, or to ask how I was managing. He called to tell me that I was making a mistake. He said that his father was trying to ensure the business stayed intact, and that litigation would damage the company and ultimately hurt everyone, including me. He said, in the careful tone of someone who has rehearsed the conversation, that he hoped I would reconsider my approach before things became adversarial. I listened to everything he said. When he finished, I asked him one question. I asked him when he had known about the trust. There was a pause. He said he had been involved in the planning process. I asked him how long ago that process had begun. Another pause. He said he wasn't sure of the exact timeline. I told him I was. I told him I had the documents and that I knew the trust had been formed within 2 months of the conversation in which his father had told me to stay in my lane. I told him I had a very good attorney, and then I told him that I loved him. Because I did. Because he is my son, and I have loved him since the moment he was born, and that loving someone and trusting them are not the same thing, and I was no longer confusing the two. He didn't call back for 6 weeks. James, my younger son, came to see me the weekend after that conversation. He drove up from Tempe and sat across from me at the same kitchen counter where I had read the divorce papers, and he said that he didn't understand how this had happened and that he didn't know what to believe. I told him I wasn't asking him to take sides. I told him what I knew and what I had documented and what I was doing about it, and I let him draw his own conclusions. He hugged me before he left. He said he would call. He called every Sunday after that. I want you to know that, because in the months that followed, when things became very difficult, those Sunday calls were one of the things that kept me steady. My daughter-in-law Daniel's wife, a woman named Priya, whom I had always liked, sent me a text message in the 4th month of the litigation. It said only, "I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. I'm just sorry." I did not respond immediately. I saved the message. I read it many times over the following weeks, and I thought about what it meant that she had sent it, and what it cost her to do so. The litigation lasted 11 months. I will not describe every detail, because some of it I am still processing, and some of it is too specific to be useful to anyone but me. What I will say is that Diane was right, that it would be expensive and difficult. Richard's attorneys challenged everything. They argued that the trust formation had been a legitimate estate planning measure, unrelated to the marriage dissolution. They argued that my contributions to the business were adequately compensated through the lifestyle the business had provided me. They argued, at one point, that my role in the company had been primarily administrative and therefore did not constitute a meaningful equity interest. Diane, let me read that brief. I don't think she entirely meant to. I think she handed it to me while she was reaching for something else, and I read the relevant paragraph before she could take it back. I'm glad I read it. It was important for me to understand precisely what my husband's attorneys were arguing about the 22 years I had spent building something alongside him. It clarified certain things. Diane submitted my documentation. She submitted 22 years of tax returns. She submitted property management records with my signature. She submitted bank statements. She submitted the lease renegotiation correspondence from 2008, which bore my name on every email, every letter, every revised agreement. She submitted the notebook entry from 2 years ago. She called an expert witness, a forensic accountant, who analyzed the timing of the asset transfers in relation to the pattern of withdrawals and the documented marital conflict, and offered an opinion about the likely intent behind the trust formation. The mediator's recommendation, issued in the 9th month, was that the trust should be partially unwound. Not entirely. The judge was unwilling to set aside the full transfer, but to the degree necessary to restore my equitable share of the marital estate. After 41 years of marriage, after 22 years of direct contribution to a business that now held assets valued at $4.1 million, I was awarded 44% of the portfolio's total value, plus a lump sum settlement for the period of the unauthorized withdrawals. Richard did not speak to me in the courtroom. He sat with his attorneys and looked at the table in front of him. And when the mediator's recommendation was read, he made no expression that I could see. He died 4 months later. A heart attack in the early morning at the house on Camelback Road that I had not lived in for nearly 2 years. Daniel called me. He was crying. I listened, and I told him I was sorry, and I meant it, because grief is not a simple thing. And the man who died was not only the man who had done what he had done, he was also the man I had married at 27. He was also the man who had held my hand in the hospital when Daniel was born. He was also the man who had, for a long time, been something close to a partner, before he decided that I was a liability to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I attended the service. There were people there who did not know what to say to me, and people who did not speak to me at all, and that was all right. I did not go for them. I went because 41 years is a long time, and because I believe in honoring the life a person lived, even when you cannot honor everything about how they lived it. Priya found me afterward, near the entrance to the reception hall. She touched my arm. She said, "I'm sorry about everything." I said, "I know." She said, "Daniel wants to talk to you. He just doesn't know how to start." I said, "I'll wait." She nodded and walked back into the room. Daniel called me 3 weeks after the funeral. He did not exactly apologize, not in a single clear statement. Not in the way I might have hoped. What he did was something more complicated and, in its own way, more real. He said he had spent 41 years watching his father handle situations by controlling the information available to everyone around him. He said he had grown up inside that pattern and had not, until recently, fully recognized it as a pattern. He said he should have asked more questions. He should have told me what he knew about the trust when he first learned of it. He was sorry he hadn't. I told him thank you. I told him that I was not asking him to have been someone different than who he was. I was only asking him, going forward, to be honest with me. He said he could do that. I don't know yet what our relationship will be. I love my son. I also know what he did and did not do during the worst year of my life. And love and trust are, as I said to him before, not the same thing. We are in the early days of figuring out who we are to each other now. I think that process will take time, and I am trying to be patient. James called the Sunday after I spoke with Daniel, as he always does. I told him about the conversation. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Do you think things can go back to normal between you and Daniel?" I thought about the word normal. I thought about what normal had meant in our family for the past several decades, what it had required of me to maintain it, what I had agreed to overlook, what it had cost me in the end. I told James that I didn't think going back was the goal. I thought the goal was going forward. He said, "That's very wise, Mom." I said, "Don't tell me that. It's not wisdom. It's just what you figure out when you don't have the option of going backward anymore." Carol came to stay with me for 2 weeks after the estate was settled. We sat on the back porch in the evenings and watched the sun go down over the desert, which it does in Phoenix, with a kind of extravagance that never entirely stops being extraordinary, no matter how many years you've watched it. We talked about some things and were quiet about others. On the last evening, before she drove back to Tucson, she said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" She said, "That you made 2 copies of everything and stored one at my house, before you even had a lawyer, before you knew what was happening." I thought about that. I think what Carol was pointing to was something I had difficulty articulating at the time, but which I understand better now. On the day I read the divorce papers, in the moment I put down that financial disclosure statement and saw that the business was not on it, something shifted. Some habit of doubt. The long practice of questioning my own perception whenever it conflicted with Richard's fell away. I saw the situation with complete clarity. And in that clarity, even before I called anyone, even before I knew what I was going to do, some part of me understood that I would need documentation and that I should keep it somewhere safe. I don't know if that's wisdom. I think it might just be what 41 years of keeping records teaches you. The portfolio is being managed now by a property management company, while the estate is finalized. Some of the properties will be sold. I've kept the 2 that I know best, the duplex on Indian School Road that we bought in 2004, which was the first property I found and researched entirely on my own, and the small commercial building on Scottsdale Road that I renegotiated out of foreclosure in 2008. I kept those because they're mine in a way that has nothing to do with the court's determination and everything to do with what I put into them. I'm not sure what I'll do next. I have considered, more than once, going back to teaching. Not because I need the income, but because I miss it. The particular quality of being useful in a way that has nothing to do with financial performance or asset values. I spent a year of my life in a courtroom arguing about what my contributions were worth. And what I kept returning to, in the quiet hours, was the memory of teaching a 5-year-old to read his name. That felt like something. It felt, in fact, like everything. For now, I'm living in a smaller house in North Scottsdale. I bought it myself, with my own money, in my own name. It has a garden in the back that was neglected when I moved in, and I have been working on it slowly, over many months, clearing out what was damaged, figuring out what might still grow. There is a section along the east wall where I planted lavender in October. Because lavender grows well in the Arizona desert, and because it is, from a practical standpoint, almost impossible to kill if you give it enough light and enough space. It came up this spring. I don't know what to tell you about what I've learned from all of this, because I'm not sure I've finished learning it. I know that a marriage is not the same as a partnership simply because both people call it that. I know that being useful is not the same as being valued. I know that the habits we develop in long relationships, the agreements, implicit and explicit, about who we are and what we're owed and what we're permitted to expect, are not natural laws. They can be renegotiated. They can, when necessary, be overturned entirely. I know that having a sister who drives 3 hours to sit with you when you can't drink your coffee is worth more than I am capable of calculating. I know that when someone tells you to stay in your lane, they are usually afraid of what you'd find if you looked at theirs. And I know this. On the Tuesday morning, 14 months ago, when a courier knocked on my door and handed me an envelope containing a petition for divorce and a financial disclosure statement that had erased 22 years of my work in a footnote, I could have accepted what that document said about me. I could have taken Gary Whitfield's number. I could have let the story end the way Richard had decided it would end. I didn't. And I am not, at 67 years old, in the smallest house I have lived in since before my children were born, with a garden I am building from nothing, and a relationship with my oldest son that is uncertain and tender and fragile and real. I am not sorry about that. Not for a single Tuesday of it. The lavender is coming up along the east wall. That's enough for right now. That is, truly, enough.